online, and let's start from the Minister of Foreign Affairs Sergei Lavrov's plan. So on the 12th of October in Bishkek, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russian Federation will take part in yet another meeting of the Council of Ministers of CIS. And let me remind you again that in 2023, Kyrgyzstan is the president of the CIS. The ministers will exchange opinions on regional as well as international topics, and we also plan to look into the multifaceted cooperation of the CIS countries, especially in light of the upcoming presidency of Russia in the organization. The ministers will adopt draft of joint statements on a number of important national topics, which will later be submitted for consideration by the CIS leaders on 30th October and approve the plan of interministerial consultations for 2024. Special attention will be paid to building up cooperation in law enforcement as well as cultural and humanitarian spheres, as well as expanding the CIS ties in the context of the Year of Russian Language of interethnic cooperation announced in CIS this year. Decisions will be taken aimed at this popularization in the Commonwealth as well as in the world. Now, as international agenda, we'll start with the Ukrainian crisis, as the Kiev regime continues to shell Russian towns, villages in cold blood, and Ukrainian militants do not hesitate to utilize the cluster munitions and attack drones against civilians. Such cynicism leads not only to the deaths of innocent people, but as well as the destruction of civil infrastructure, including residential buildings, schools, hospitals, and kindergarten. On October the 1st, the Ukrainian armed forces shelled the central market area in Shebek in the Belgorod region. 3 people were wounded. Facades of trade pavilions and municipal garages and 3 cars were damaged. On the night of 2nd October, the Nazis opened fire in residential areas of Novaya Kakhovka, and the civilian was killed. Often, the targets of neo-Nazis are religious sites. For example, on September the 13th, the Ukrainian armed forces hit the Nikolsky monastery in DNR, injuring 2 people. Russian law enforcement agencies are constantly recording all these atrocities. The course of the Russian Federation, based on the evidence collected by the Russian Investigative Committee, continues to pass sentences on Ukrainian militants who have committed grave crimes against civilians. Last week, the punishes Skarlupov and Pahalsky were sentenced to 28 and 19 years imprisonment, respectively. We had to serve in a strict regime colony for the murder of civilians, as well as shelling of residential areas in the DNR in the spring of 2022. The militant and neo-Nazi organization Azov Verbansky was sentenced to 22 years in prison. He shelled residential areas of Mariupol with mortars last March, and another neo-Nazi Lazovika was sentenced to 28 years in prison for killing a wounded DNR prisoner of war in Mariupol. 3 neo-Nazis, Bondarev, Vaishenko, and Yimkevich, received 20 years in prison each for shelling civilian vehicles in Mariupol last spring. For each crime of a Kiev regime, however, it had been committed by, it will be followed by respective punishment, which will be hard. And it was just recently when the Investigative Committee of Russia announced the completion of investigation into the case of a member of Verkhovная Rada Parasyuk, who in March of 2016 participated in an action by radical structures illegally entering the territory of the Consulate General of Russia. He ripped the national flag of Russia, took it to the protesters, and trampled it. He also publicly called on those present to commit unlawful acts against the diplomatic institution and staff, and the criminal case against Parasyuk has been sent to the court to decide whether to refer him to court. He goes on international wanted list, and the Investigative Committee of Russia has charged him in absentia with the use of drones. This concerns the head of the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, Main Intelligence Directorate Budanov, as well as the commander of the Air Force, Lenchuk, Commander Nishpapa, and the commander of the 383rd Separate Regiment of remotely piloted drones, Budinyak. we are also to be put on the wanted list. On October the 2nd, Kyiv hosted an informal meeting of the EU foreign ministers, chaired by the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. But I think that it's the policy of danger now. So we were presided by Josep Borrell, and this session was defined by them as a brainstorming fashion, but I think that it's like storming the brains of the EU, bearing in mind that the perspectives for further financing of the Kiev regime were not clear. The Europeans had promised to support the regime, and we had promised to continue to do so, but it's of interest that the ministers of Hungary and Poland did not reach the Ukrainian capital, and both Budapest and Warsaw had accumulated a lot of claims for Zelensky's policy. It turns out that this brainstorming session did not lead to any significant results, and European diplomats had failed to agree on the next allocation of military aid to Ukraine in the amount of 5 billion euros in 2024, and now this amount is to be agreed on by the end of the year. But let's be frank, it's not financial aid in the amount of 5 billion euros. It's not any aid to Ukraine. It's those money they are to spend to kill people with the help of the Kiev regime. This money is going to be spent on killing Ukrainians. What influenced this decision is they had not agreed on the amount, and that Washington, albeit for a short period of time, of 45 days, left Kiev without cash allowance, and political scientists agree on that. The temporary budget adopted by the U.S. Congress on September the 13th does not include a single cent for Ukraine's needs, and this state of affairs has seriously alarmed Brussels, and Borrell has already promised that he will continue to ask Biden not to cut off funding for Ukraine. But let's be clear, this is not financial aid, this is not financing Ukraine, it's financing the atrocities that the Kiev regime leads at the expense of the West. We have repeatedly said that the European Union has lost its autonomy and its sovereignty long ago. At the same time, it's obvious that not all of the EU citizens have any rights to vote, even inside their countries, because not everyone inside their countries are ready to continue to blindly spend money on the maintenance of Kiev junta, especially bear in mind the fact that despite the efforts of Western sponsors, the Ukrainian budget deficit is growing rapidly, and the so-called collective West does not intend to abandon its goal of inflicting, as we put it, strategic defeat on Russia. So they call on Bundestag to hand over the Taurus cruise missiles to Kiev, as the chairman of the Committee on Defense, Maria-Agnes Stark-Zimmerman, has said, and she says that she considers the potential strikes of on the territory of Russia with these missiles justified, and this is a statement full of Russophobia and revanchism, and it makes us understand that Berlin has not realized what this thoughtless pumping of arms against the criminal Kiev regime could lead to. The other day, responded to the request to comment on the public participation of the CS's division in Galicia. The president of Germany said that they were not ready to call the Banderites anti-Semites and Nazis in general. I have another question to Maria-Agnes Stark-Zimmerman. What does she think of the CS's division Galicia? I think it's a question which you can give a clear and easy answer to. This will make us understand why she supports this pumping of arms of the Kiev regime, and why does she think that those potential strikes on the territory of Russia are justified? I don't think it will be difficult to answer this question. The question concerning your attitude towards the Galicia division and the OU and the UPA. So what I have cited directly speaks of the fact that the German authorities seem to have forgotten the lessons of history, but they are to remember them better than anywhere else. We are to be more sensitive and intolerant to any manifestation and inhumane ideology, no matter where it occurs. However, we see the contrary, as Berlin denies the generally recognized fact that Ukrainian nationalism collaborated with Hitler's Third Reich, and hence a conclusion: in today's Germany, the rehabilitation of Nazism is in full swing. However, there are people who are more cynical than that, the Anglo-Saxons, who are ready to exterminate all Ukrainians to achieve their goals. They are to rehabilitate no matter what, the UNOPA, the Galicia division. I think the next step will be the so-called heroes of the Third Reich. Former British Defense Minister Ben Wallace has complained that the average age of Ukrainian soldiers is 40 years. He has called on Zelensky to actively mobilize the young. Does this not remind you of anything? It does remind me of Hitlerjugend. London does not care about Ukraine's future because what's at stake is the realization of its cherished dream, the strategic defeat on Russia, inflicting it with foreign hands. And for that purpose, it's necessary to throw Ukrainians into the battle without regard for casualties, without the regard of this once populous republic. And this goal could not have been achieved this way. The British Isles don't rule out the deployment of its regular military units to Ukraine. I'm not making this up. This scenario was suggested by the country's current defense minister, Grant Shapps. So these are the kind of people they appoint. How he was appointed is a question to me, bearing in mind his former history. It was either him or somebody else who had came up with this idea, because the current British defense minister then hesitant to retract his own words. But we know what those British defense ministers say is what many British authorities think. And against this background, we should pay attention to the report of the New York Times of September 29th. So the Pentagon Hospital in Landstuhl had begun accepting wounded American mercenaries. According to the paper, here in this hospital, 40 U.S. citizens are now being treated there, and they had fought on the side of the Ukrainian armed forces. Please tell me if this is just the New York Times who had came up, who had found this out. So what do Pentagon, the State Department could say on that, because they care about it in the most faraway regions. We're talking about Ukrainian citizens. Are we going to see the official statement of the State Department on that? We see that how inadequate the West is when conducting its foreign policy, how Russophobic it is, how we seek to help Ukraine killing it, in fact. And we see that all those goals of the special military operations are very acute. And the 29th of September, the President of the Russian Federation has signed a decree, because as we see, last year Kiev regime decided to introduce a visa regime for Russian citizens, unilaterally terminating the bilateral intergovernmental agreement on visa-free travel. And let me remind you that before that there had never been a visa regime between Russia and Ukraine, and even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, now there was a free trade of our citizens, but this decision was aimed at making human contacts as difficult as possible. And the Russian side has repeatedly said that we will not take the lead we will not play off against ordinary people interested in maintaining their family and spiritual ties. And based on this humanitarian logic, the visa-free regime for Ukrainian citizens was retained in the adopted decree of the President of Russian Federation, the draft of which underwent a thorough study, consolidated the existing order of those conditions terminated by the Kiev regime. So Ukrainians will continue to enter Russia not only without visas, but also using their internal passports, even if they have expired. The ability to come to Russia and stay there freely is extremely important for numerous Ukrainian refugees, residents of our new regions who are yet to obtain their Russian passports, as well as citizens of our country who have relatives and friends in Ukraine. And now to continue with those hatred, what we've talked. So last week, it was the 82nd anniversary of the Babi Yar tragedy. So in 1941, in just 2 days, on September 29th and the 30th, 1941, the Hitler's invaders and militants killed more than 30,000 Jews, so about 20% of the Jewish population in Kiev. This punitive action was just the beginning, was just the prologue of mass shootings of old people, women, children, Soviet prisoners of war and underground fighters of all nationalities from 1941 to 1943. More than 100,000 people were executed, and Babi Yar became an international grave and a symbol of the inhumane cruelty of the Nazis. So this year at events in Kiev on September 29th, the president of Ukraine said, quote unquote, "It is very important to always remember history," quote unquote. Well, yes, with some kind of a broken clock would show the right time twice a day. If we're talking about a mechanical clock, it's hard to disagree with that. The problem is that this clock is really broken because Zelensky himself persistently tries to forget everything that's linked to the past of his own country, the nation that he thinks he's part of, and his own family. So on September 22nd, the whole world saw footage of him applauding the so-called veteran of the SS Galicia division, Hunka. So did he forget for a second that his own grandfather fought in the Red Army against this kind of traitors and collaborators as this Hunka? Or did he not forget this for a second? Judging by our steps taken by the Kiev regime, he did not forget about this for a second. This is some kind of amnesia that just goes on. And it's of no surprise because the glorification of Nazi Banderite thugs has long been a phenomenon familiar to the Ukraine under the Kiev regime. The authorities try to erase those from people's memory the heroism of the Red Army soldiers, and at the same time we whitewash Hitler and his soldiers, and those role in the deaths of civilians is not only silenced but it's purposefully glorified. So honor festive processions are held, monuments are built and erected, stadiums and streets are renamed. Is this some kind of historical amnesia? No, I don't think that it's a problem of one single person, even though he's just a puppet. It's a betrayal of the memory of the ancestors, of the history of your own country, your own nation. Another thing connected to that, the scandal about the so-called hard glorification of the CSS Galicia division participant. So this were not just those who saw the Nazi nature of the Western elite. What we're talking about is those collaborators that are yet to be defeated.
So it seems that there have been words of the Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau about those who have participated in that glorification of the Nazi veteran. So they just betrayed the ancestors of the victims of Nazism. And they just pointed the finger at the chairman of the Canadian Parliament and said that they were just completely innocent. It has been just recently, but the problem is that this strategy is much more deeper. It's not about some people in the government of Canada who preach this Nazi ideology. It's not just separate figures. It's the Vice Minister of the government of Canada and the granddaughter of the Nazi Homak, and they just spoke about their relations towards the Nazi fighter. It was Active Club Canada, and they said that they consider their colleague, quote, a war hero, and accused journalists of persecuting him. But we all remember that it has been recently that the scandals also in Canada when non-governmental organizations who are in charge of the search of the Nazis or journalists carrying out the investigation, they searched some fighters of the Third Reich who resided in some Canadian province, and those scandals finalized, I do not know, with the shame to those who hid those neo-Nazis. And they got prison terms, and the society, it was just glad that the justice exists, even in decades, but still it existed. But what is happening now? Against the background of a wild scandal, organizations appear that start to applaud all that and publicly carry out actions in support. And in the social media, laying flowers by the club members was published. It's the Division Galicia, renamed in 1945. It's just stated at the memorial, quote, to participants of the battles near Brody. Such clubs of activists are growing like mushrooms in Western countries, and their total number exceeded 100. It's just those who act legally, completely legally. As journalists note, their actions to recruit new members is underway. When they recruit, engage the new members according to their own values, they are forbidden to speak about history, about Jews. They act just in a different way during their advertisement campaigns. They talk about the values of brotherhood, community, sport, and self-defense. So they ignore the moments that are just major for their organization, that should cause panic fear from any person. It's all just ignored. There's just the history of brotherhood and community. But that was before. Now they just do not conceal their essence. They're just open. Why? Because they understand that it all remains unpunished, that the ideology of the whole states is based on that they get global prizes for that they can find themselves in the center of the global agenda, not under the sign of might, but under the sign of And they are provided grants in the West, and they provide weapons that have previously been prohibited for conflict zones. They have felt their moral superiority, and the times mentioned by their predecessors, they are coming, they feel that. They just use this moment to legalize themselves as a fighting unit against the Russians. They do not just see the conjuncture, but the green light. So they do not know the history very well, the history of the Second World War, when the SS troops also included the formations of nearly all the European countries. In the US and Canada, there are tons of monuments to Nazi collaborators. There are streets called after the famous collaborators. The Galicia Division monuments have been erected in Elkins Park near Philadelphia in Warren, Michigan State. There is also a summer camp in Baraboo, the state of Wisconsin, with the monument to Ukrainian nationalists and the monuments to Petlura, Shukhevich, and Bandera. So does anyone know about it in the US and Canada? Does the OSCE know about it? Everyone is aware of that. But as well as back then, in the 30s and the 40s, they just keep silence. Not only keep silence, but welcome that. They are waiting for Russia to become weak, and they will not achieve that. Blinken has made a speech recently by trying to accuse the Soviet Union of keeping silence about the tragedy of Babi Yar. In the Soviet Union, they just did not live through this tragedy of Babi Yar. Back then, in the 1945, there was a decision about the memory of that tragedy. And the whole 20th century, the 40s, the 60s, the 80s, and so on. There were films, there were monuments, poems were written. And they were written as well at the level of the state. It's just the lie of Blinken. And it covers everything. He should have explained why there are monuments on the territory of America to collaborators of Holocaust, why they continue to prepare the youth battalions, and how they are financed. And what are the moral ethical norms for that of the liberal democracy? So our way of life is different. Starting from March this year, on the initiative of Sergei Narishkin, the register is developed of the monuments to Soviet fighters, and they are based on the registers created on the initiative of our ministry, and I am proud of that, of our department. And now it is immense electronic map that contains many monuments in our country and abroad, and Russian militias abroad participate in its development. Diplomats, consulates, and embassies. So that's the work that is not about functional duties. Yes, there are such duties in the work of the modern diplomats, but that's the work carried out by our colleagues sincerely, and not only in working hours. The list of the lost memorial sites in unfriendly countries combines data from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defense, as well as historical materials collected by volunteers and concerned compatriots. We receive letters with the descriptions of the graves found by our compatriots, where the access is only through passes or metrical data or their birth certificates. They tell us about that, and they help to restore the historical connections, the relation ties, and we are grateful for that. There are also annual reports of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the situation with the glorification of Nazism, on modern forms of Nazism, xenophobia, and intolerance connected with that. These reports cover in detail the facts of vandalism with regard to the Soviet monuments and violating the memory of the Soviet fighters who have saved the West from the Nazi plague have become the norm in a number of countries in Eastern Europe. We just record those Russophobic actions as well as on the electronic map now. This has been posted on the websites of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and our consular posts. And we recommend to all of those who are interested to take part in its development as well. There will be links in the text version of the Today briefing. So now from the historical practices of Nazism to the modern ones. The decision of the General Assembly of the International Paralympic Committee on the temporary suspension of the Russian Paralympic Committee membership is just a similar topic. And I would like to say that the decision of the General Assembly of the International Paralympic Committee in Manama, Bahrain on September 27-29 this year to partially suspend the membership of the Russian Paralympic Committee and to suspend the participation of Paralympic athletes in competitions only in a neutral status. It should not be left without attention. It's about the Paralympic Committee being transformed into a platform for revenge to those who have been, so to say, guilty on a national basis. And it's about Paralympic athletes who overcome not only the laws of physics sometimes and some personal characteristics, they just overcome the feelings of desire for comfort and somewhere just physical pain. So it's just those people who overcome their fortune. It's about those who have found ways to start their life afresh. About people who do not have any possibility in any way, it would seem, to change the way of their lives, but still they change it. Not thanks to some connections, money, or miracles, but thanks to the strength of their spirit, their will, the help of their relatives, and the support of the state. I would remind that earlier, in November 2022, the International Paralympic Committee had already suspended the membership of the Russian Paralympic Committee, including the admission of Russian Paralympic athletes to participate in competitions, including the Paralympic Games. And the decision was cancelled by the Special Appeals Tribunal. The tribunal found no violation of membership obligations on the part of the Russian Paralympic Committee. And no traces of violations were found by the Russian Paralympic Committee. And neither the Russian Paralympic Committee nor other national committees had any legal obligations to comply with that decision. Unfortunately, that did not stop those hard-headed functionaries that still consider themselves able to forbid the Russian Paralympic athletes to participate in competitions. It's just shameful. There is shame. And the way of those people, it should be understood, that have become disabled through different reasons. And they prove by their example that life continues despite everything. They just give hope to a large number of people to continue their lives, to move forward, despite all the obstacles. The authority of the Russian Paralympic Committee among the foreign partners has allowed to not to allow the worst decision and to let the athletes participate in a neutral status. It just violates the basic principles of the equal sports movements, and it's just contrary to any principles of discrimination. And the Russian Paralympic Committee, it just continues to be neutral and impartial in the issues of politics. It's just about sports and focused on its tasks, that is allowing disabled athletes participate according to the Olympic standards. And voting at the International Paralympic General Assembly, it just testifies of the majority of countries being tired about those games and supporting the return of our athletes to Paralympic sports. We will continue to support our athletes and the role of sports in development of interhuman ties and respectful communication and rapprochement and unification of peoples. I should not give some blank promises. It's just knowledge that is based on many factors, on the knowledge of history, the understanding of how similar situations have been overcome by the humankind already. And I know that very soon for all those crimes by the West, the collective West, not only with regard to Russia, but also with regard to other countries, there will be revenge. And I know that those actions taken against the citizens of our country, the citizens of other countries, people they identify as Russians. You know, Russian means not only nationality, but also citizenship in English. It's just belonging to the Russian history and culture. What they just commit in their nationalistic fervor, they will be ashamed of that, as it has been with the case of their fathers in the Third Reich. They just engaged in the same thing. It's just different forms, hybrid forms, but the essence it's the same. So a number of EU countries, Bulgaria, Latvia, Poland, Germany, Estonia, they just declared a ban on the import of Russian cars registered in Russia. When the first reports about it appeared, not everyone believed in that. Just to openly, on a national basis, just to segregate people.
With everyone watching, without even an attempt to explain this or to link this to some kind of logic, it later turned out that this was not just the truth, but we were in full swing towards this direction. So we think that these are illegitimate actions against Russian citizens based on nationalism in the neo-Nazi logic. You can call it anything you want, the neo-Nazism, the current forms of Nazism. The nature stays the same. And the basis was decisions of separate European countries was the same absurd logic. For example, the sanctions by the US against our country, as it was stated in the explanation by the European Commission and the procedure applying to embargo on the import of the certain goods from Russia, which bring quote-unquote significant revenues, quote-unquote, to our country. I must admit that this kind of brainstorm in the EU will lead them to some kind of absolute abyss. But I will still tell them, but when people leave a country on a car and they enter their territory of their country, this bring revenue to their country, not our country. So when they leave a country on a car, they spend money in the country where what they drive through. We pay at the gas stations, they pay for sightseeing spots, products, food, this kind of things, no matter what. But now we understand that they can make a travesty of anything, and even when we used to glorify heroes of the Second World War, monuments were erected, holidays were celebrated, the territory of the so-called Eastern Europe. Now it's the west of Europe, and now this monuments are demolished and then new ones for collaborators are erected. Why should we even try and come up with some kind of arguments which are based on certain factors? We can just say that the entrance of the cars with Russian license plates into a number of EU countries is now banned because it brings revenues to Russia, and against the background of increasingly obvious fiasco of European anti-Russian sanctions policy, its member states are now making no secret of the fact that they would like to try to get, even for this failure, in all Russians, but that they stay directly. So this is precisely the reason for new prohibitive measures which violate fundamental international legal norms and the falsehood of previous claims by European politicians and officials in Brussels. But the sanctions are allegedly not aimed at ordinary Russians is evidence. Now they say that they are aimed at ordinary Russians. And recently the objective of damaging the entire Russian people has been stated quite openly in European capitals. It says the EU doesn't realize that such blatantly discriminatory action is just puts an end to all kind of humanitarian human rights policy that they claimed at the level of legal acts. At first we tried to intimidate our politicians, our leading public figures, when they turned to the businessmen, journalists. It did not work, they failed to achieve the result. Civil servants, military personnel, employees of the judicial system, election commissions and human rights commissioners were included, but all in vain. When we began terrorizing the inhabitants of new Russian regions for many years, and even since 2014, the citizens of Crimea could not obtain a visa to enter European countries, which speak so highly of the impossibility of discrimination, of human rights. And now the turn has come to all Russians with no exception. You know, at first many thought, there were people who thought that you should give a promise to the Kiev regime. You should, I don't know, erect a flag or say that you are not on the Russian side. but you're on the side of the Western states, and when everything will be all right and you'll be able to you'll be able to become the heroes of a so-called Russia, Western Russophobic frenzy. But now, these people are being harassed inside the European Union. What I'm talking about is what, no matter what is made up as an attempt to exercise pressure on the whole Russian nation, all of this is doomed to failure, and we're now looking at the possibility of we're now considering this ban as another attempt not just to resurrect the Iron Curtain Europe, but as a kind of a real renaissance of Nazism with all its forms. This measure is designed to further narrow those few opportunities for contacts between our people and our common European continent, but have survived until now, as well as to impose logic of segregation on the basis of nationality on those who for decades have been taught to think this impossible even in theory. I can say that at present the relevant agencies are working, or we're establishing contacts, so to say, to come up with a retaliation measure for that, and when these decisions will be adopted, we will inform you. But I can say that without a certain retaliation measure, those actions, we will not leave them without a retaliation measure. And I think the same thing goes for those decisions made in the past. We are talking about the Green Deal. We are talking about other discriminatory measures and steps undertaken by the West against our country. We thought that we would not respond, but we do respond. We are capable of that. We do it every time, but not in the way many would like us to do it. We do it after giving it deep consideration. That's the way we're going to do it this time. And in other news, on October 2nd, the Embassy of Japan in Russia has strongly protested against the large-scale Japanese-American military exercise on the island of Hokkaido in the close proximity to the borders of Russian Federation. As well as we also have plans to carry out a number of similar maneuvers in late October, December this year. We pointed to the Japanese side with the categorical inadmissibility of such actions near our frontiers, especially jointly with NATO member states. We have also warned them that the irresponsible policy of the Kishida administration puts Japan on the path of dangerous escalation of tension in Northeast Asia and Asia-Pacific region in the whole. I would like to also say a few words of the results of the Fifth International Conference of the prohibition of chemical weapons. So at the margins of this forum, a declaration at the level of ministers was adopted on strategic issues of the development of a global chemical industry in the context of human health, environmental protection, sustainable management of chemicals, principles and mechanisms of international cooperation in these issues. Russia was not represented at the high level of a segment due to a very simple fact. The German side had not issued a visa to the head of a Russian delegation, which was a representative of Russian Ministry of Industry and Trade. At the closing of the conference, the Russian delegation made a statement that the disagreement with certain provisions of a ministerial declaration emphasizing the improper fulfillment by the host state of its obligations to hold an international event under the auspices of the UN. And I would like to hope that the UN will pay attention to that, and I hope that the journalists will pose a question on the reaction of the UN to some kind of a disrespect for the obligations of those countries which hold the UN events, and we believe that the behavior of German authorities is unacceptable and calls into question Berlin's ability to ensure proper level of preparation of such events in the future, and will take this into consideration when deciding on the venue for UN conferences in the future. These days, from October 2nd to October 6th, the 7th International Conference Eurasian Bridge is taking place. We have been holding this since 2017 with the help of the Minister of Culture of Russian Federation in the Crimea region. different kinds of programs will be present, and people will see films from Qatar, Palestine, Serbia, Tunisia, France, and many other countries. The works will be evaluated by international jury, which includes foreign filmmakers as well. As part of the festival, a retrospective for the 100th anniversary of Leonid Gaidai will be shown, as well as a out of competition program of short animation by the students of GEEK. And we welcome such events, bearing in mind that it's an international one. And we also welcome the foreign participants of these festival, which will be a vivid confirmation of expansion of creative contacts in the sphere of cinematography, and will create conditions for further development of intercultural dialogue and strengthening of trust between nations. 80 years ago, on the 40th of October of 1943, the Soviet Union was one of the first countries to recognize Iceland's independence and establish diplomatic ties with it, whilst contributing to the establishment of sovereign Icelandic state. And today's anniversary takes place against the background of a crisis in the Russian-Icelandic relations provoked by Reykjavik's hostile attitudes toward Russia. As clearly, the order to please its big brother in the face of US and the EU, the Icelandic authorities chose to destroy the multifaceted, mutually beneficial partnership with the Russian Federation, which had been built up over the years. Reykjavik decided to terminate the cooperation and lowered the level of bilateral diplomatic relation from July the 1st, so that's some kind of a celebration. And the Icelandic authorities have joined the European anti-Russian sanctions to the detriment of their own economist interest. They support the Kiev regime and contribute to the buildup of NATO on their own territory. Reykjavik has forgotten the support provided by our country in difficult times for Icelandic people, when Icelandic's so-called allies turned us back on it. It looks like the joint struggle against fascism during the Second World War is forgotten as well, but this is the choice of Icelandic authorities, which follows the line of Russophobic tendencies. Maybe they fail to speak against this Western trend, but the history will put everything in its place, and the rule and authority of Iceland should know this as well. On the October 4th, the Paris hosts another session of the Executive Board of UNESCO, and the delegation of Russian Federation will be headed by Renato Lyudinov, the permanent delegate to UNESCO. We are going to consider the implementation of decisions resolution adopted by the Executive Board and General Conference at the previous sessions. It will take place from the 7th to 22nd November this year, and the Director General of UNESCO will present the draft program and budget for 2024-2025, as well as a report implementation of the current program and the budget, and on the results achieved from 2018 to 2021, as well as the draft staffing strategy of organizations for 2023 to 2027. In addition, member states of the Executive Board will discuss topics related to the implementation of conventions and recommendations, including the 1960 Convention Against Discrimination in Education, or 2021 recommendation on the ethical aspects of artificial intelligence, etc., etc. Also, achievement of sustainable development goals and the preparation of UNESCO Global Report on the literacy and cultural policies following the Mondial Cult 2022 World Conference, and the development of a new system of cultural statistics. We'll also work on the strategic policy framework for multilingualism and the participation of UNESCO in the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science, administrative and financial matters, the themes of UNESCO, prizes, the celebration of anniversaries, proposals for the designation of UNESCO institution centers. And let me remind you that the work of 270th session will continue until October 18th, and we'll share with you the results of the session and the Russians' work in the session. That October 7th marks the 21st anniversary of the Organization of Collective Security. It was established when it was given the status of international regional organization and the subsequent approval of the CSTO Charter. In a relatively short period of time, the organization came a long way, and now it unites 6 probably countries: Russia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. And thanks to our joint efforts of our allies, this organization is now perceived as a reputable, multifunctional structure, but has confirmed its effectiveness in ensuring security in the region. Our work has been carried out in 3 key areas: political cooperation, military cooperation, and countering new challenges and threats. The collective security strategy up to 2025 is being implemented. It is a program document that defines the main actors of development. The state members agree and coordinate the international policy positions on key international and regional security issues. The allies consolidate their efforts in combating international terrorism, extremism, illicit trafficking of drugs, psychotropic substances, as well as organized transnational crime, illegal migration, and our threats to stability in the region. Inside the Collective Security Treaty Organization, such segment as the powerful collective force is being implemented. So the coherence of the actions of servicemen from allied countries are improved during trainings, exercises, and next week from October 9th to October 13th, Kyrgyzstan will host an exercise with the Unbreakable Brotherhood peacekeeping forces, which will be a final stage of joint training this year. A necessary condition to integrate the peacekeeping potential into United Nations peacekeeping activities being formed. CSTO is open to cooperation with third countries and other organizations in the security field. The entry of force of the CSTO observer and partner statuses has opened up additional opportunities to widen the cooperation of this organization. Further increasing of cooperation with CSTO member states and strengthening its potential and enhancing the international role of organization remains a priority for Russian Federation's foreign policy. October 9th marks the day of the Soviet defeat of Nazi troops in the Battle of Caucasus. The corresponding additions to the federal law on the days of military glory and commemorative dates of Russia were made on July the 21st of 2022. The Battle of Caucasus was one of the longest and one of the bloodiest in the Great Patriotic War, which it lasted for 142 days from July 25th to October 9th, 1943. This battle unfolded in extremely difficult circumstances because the spring of 1942 Hitler sent his troops to deprive the USSR of the main economic bases in the south of the country, and most importantly to seize the Caucasian oil, which without which the German war machine was doomed to defeat. So the main forces of the enemy were concentrated in the southern section, and despite the monstrous onslaught of the enemy and its superior forces, the Soviet troops heroically defended every settlement, every line, and every height. The operation took part in 2 stages from 25th of July to 31st of December. There was an offensive on the part of the German army, which managed to capture part of territory, but from December 21st of the Soviet troops launched a counteroffensive, forcing Nazis to retreat and recapture the territories captured by the enemy. In the course of the offensive in the North Caucasus in 1943, the enemy suffered enormous losses. About 275,000 soldiers and officers were killed, more than 6,000 were taken prisoner. In 790 tanks were destroyed, more than 2,000 aircrafts, more than 2,000 guns, more than 7,000 tankers, and so on. During these battles, Krasnodar region, Kalmykia, Chechen Ingushetia, Northern Ossetia, Kabardino-Balkaria, Rostov region, Stavropol region, Cherkasy, Karachay, and again autonomous regions were liberated. The old fields of Maykop were returned to the Soviet army, to the Soviet authorities, as well as the most important agricultural areas. The feats of the defenders were highly appreciated by the leadership of the country. On January 25th, the Medal for the Defense of the Caucasus was established. It was awarded to more than 870,000 participants. More than 100 people were awarded the title of the Heroes of the Union. The people of North Caucasus and Transcaucasia will always remember this sacrifice. And this feat of Soviet soldiers should serve as a constant reminder to our country as well as other countries, but it was together that we won. And that on the unity of all the peoples of Soviet Union depended not only our fate, but the fate of the entire world. And it's not just Russia that talks about these days, but the countries of a so-called world majority on the African as well as Asian region and in Latin America talk about it these days, because without the victory in the Second World War, no decolonization would ever have been started, and the nations would never have achieved independence, sovereignty from the colonial regime. Another important thing.
It's an interesting date, the 11th of October. It's the anniversary of the Zemsky Sobor in Moscow. The Kiev Rus state, and it was according to a request by the Cossacks who suffered from Polish oppression. As it was said, under the high hand of the Moscow sovereign, it meant war with Poland, but the opinion was united, was unanimous. It was just in accordance with the interests and aspirations of forcibly separated Russian lands. And after the Mongol Tatar invasion, the old Russian states was significantly weakened, which was taken advantage of by its neighbors. Already in the 14th century, the Lithuanians captured many lands, and the Poles seized southwestern Russian lands, Galicia and western Volhynia. Bukovina was included in the Moldovan Principality, and it went to the Hungarian Kingdom in the 11th century. In the 15th century, Turkey seized Moldova and South Russian lands, and they were put into the dependence of the Crimean Khanate. In the 16th century, Poland seized the left bank of the Dnieper and some other lands, and however, the Russian people were not assimilated. It was the high level of economic and cultural development, the internal strength, and the ethnic and economic, cultural, political ties being preserved and continuing to develop. It was the period of fragmentation of the Kiev Rus. The Russian people just struggled against the enslavers and wished to restore their unity. Back then, the enemies were the Turks and the Crimean Tatars, as well as the Polish Pans, and the struggle was led by the Cossacks of the Zaporizhian Sich and the Don. In 1612, the liberation struggle grew, and the lands captured by the Poles sought to reunite with Eastern Russia, with Moscow. And that all led to the war against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and Hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky led the struggle against the impression of Poland. And Russia provided help to the rebels, as they said back then, with bread and cannons, as well as diplomatic methods. The representatives of Malay Russia addressed the Russian sovereigns to take it under its high hand. Such plans often appeared among the Cossacks. In February 1651, the Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich spoke about his readiness to accept Malay Russia as his subject, and announced his consent in June 1653. And the Zemsky Sobor made its final decision on the 11th of October 1653. On the 8th of January 1654, the Pereyaslav Rada unanimously spoke about the reunification with Moscow, Russia. It was the unification of the United Russian people divided during the Mongol Tatar invasion, and the unification began back then. So now this anniversary of the Zemsky Sobor has a symbolic significance. That year, Azov region, Kherson region, and Donbass just returned to Russia. They considered themselves as part of Russian world, and their free and legitimate choice should be respected. And any attempts to influence them by force are doomed to failure. And there is one more announcement about the Cultural Center of Glavo-Padeka. The presentation of this series territory in education, science and sports. We will post this announcement on our website and in social media. I invite all the media representatives to cover this very interesting and relevant event. Is Международная жизнь, International Life, with us? Yes, hello, Madam Zakharova. In Tambov, the Mural Art Festival has finished, and there was a picture of Mr. Lavrov and Mr. Primakov there. How did you say mural art? So it was on rocks, now it is on the walls. Very well. So it's just the implementation of this project. How would you comment on that in the context of the upcoming Teachers' Day? So just some projects, they remain on the rocks in a bad sense of this word, and some of them go to the walls. So the year 2023 was declared in Russia the year of the teacher and mentor. The Mentors Quarter in Tambov became a contribution of artists to this year's program. So it was just their vision. When I first heard about this project, I just thought maybe we misunderstood something, but then I saw that we understood everything correctly. This festival dedicated to Russian mentorship and culture, it's just passing knowledge, experience in many areas of life, and the characters of these murals, who are they? They're just prominent figures in art, in sports, in politics, those who become people who inspire young people. So among the works of the festival, there is, so to say, a portrait. It's not a drawing, it's a portrait, a depiction of Mr. Primakov and Mr. Lavrov. I would like to remind you that this project is implemented on the initiative of the Russian Society's Znanie, and Sergei Lavrov is a member of the League of Lecturers of this society. I think this project is quite successful, and in the text of today's briefing we will post a link to this mural, and your task is to estimate, to provide your opinion. I would like to highlight that the Foreign Ministry learned about this initiative already when it has been nearly implemented. It was just a sovereign decision of non-governmental structures of civil society. When they passed to the final stage, they asked our opinion on some details, and we provided our input there. But the initiative was from the civil society. I would like to underline that. Do you have any other questions? If not, we will move on. Russia Today, please. Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. We have two questions today. The first one, in Pristina, there were accusations about the death of 3 Serbs and one Kosovar policeman. How would Russia comment on the accusations of Serbia, and just observing that in silence? You know better than all of us that the leadership of Serbia has already commented in detail the accusations by Pristina, and no doubts have been left that the Pristina accusations are just pointless. They do not have any grounds. And the dialogue on Kosovo, it demonstrates that the only side that seeks some legal, civilized outcome is Belgrade. With the consideration of the historical context of modern situation, the European Union has completely discredited itself as a moderator. It's in the Balkans, and there will be questions about Armenia as well today. There were just promises. It was just provocative actions that led to the detonation of the situation that should have been and could have been resolved in a legal manner, taking into account the historical peculiarities of the situation. So any attempts to demonstrate that Serbia is a warmonger, it is just absurd, and it aims at discreditation of Belgrade and to draw attention, to divert attention from the ethnic cleansing that is underway in the province. So the Prime Minister Kurti, he just turned the intimidation of non-Albanian population into a daily routine after his terrible words that the Serbs in Kosovo should, citation, suffer and pay. So they have just a desire to protect themselves, their families, homes, their culture and traditions. What is normal values for a normal person, the true values. So, with regard to the international presence in Kosovo, under the auspices of NATO and the EU, they have not had any desire to fulfill their mandates, and they were not going to do that. They're just playing along with Pristina, as they have already done. So one more question. It's just the Western sponsors of the Western sponsors and the Pristina authorities accused the Serbian Orthodox Church of smuggling weapons into northern Kosovo and Metohija. So what are the attempts to involve the church in the conflict? It's just not connected with the trend. It's just the Western policy that destroys the Orthodox faith all over the world. They just attack the Orthodox Church. It's just attacked by the West. It has previously been in a secret manner. Now it is in a direct manner. They interrogate, they arrest clergymen, and they undertake provocative actions that do not correspond to any moral norms, ethical norms. They just make people quarrel, people who are of Orthodox faith, and they invent some new history of global religions. So it's no surprise that now the Serbian Orthodox Church is an object of attention by the collective West, an object of aggression. Now I can just confirm that in the region, in the Balkans, they know better than anywhere else that the Serbs have been on those lands for centuries, and the Orthodox faith has been present there for centuries, and it has always been a bone in the throat of the Kosovo Albanian separatism. So here we need to consider the regional aspect of the situation and to see the global trend as with regard to aggression against the Orthodox people. So I just wanted to pass on to Russia Today. Sorry, yes, we would like to ask a question about the estimations from Moscow by the European Union mission in Nagorno-Karabakh. So if we take the latest events, the fighting on the 19th and the 20th of September, so just the European observers, their position is just mean. It's the meanest one. They just made promises and led Yerevan into some of their trap, and they just became silent witnesses of the development of the situation. And with regard to the agreements that were made under the mediatorship of Moscow, it was the Western community that led them away from those agreements, and Brussels was among the main and the first supporters of not following the agreements of Moscow, Yerevan and Baku, and follow some special way. And where the special way led, we just witnessed today. As the Russian peacemakers being mediators in the ceasefire agreements, it was just witnessed by the European Union, and they did not provide any assistance. So, following the end of the Lachen corridor blockade, humanitarian aid there, and normalization of relations between Baku and Yerevan, the European Union just witnessed that in silence. Silently, just telling the Armenian citizens some fairy tales about Russian deception. It's not Russian deception. Russia has always been near them, has always stopped the bloodshed in the region. And Yerevan was just discouraged to follow those agreements by the European Union. It was the betrayal of the European Union. So we evacuated more than 100 of victims of this Stepanakert explosion. Where were those supporters back then? They did not participate in the fightings where the Russian peacekeepers died. They just intensified the fightings. So let us tell it directly. The European Union mission does not provide any stability. It's just investigation monitoring for the interests of Brussels and provoking the situation. Some loud and deceptive speeches, statements are more than enough. And recently, an interview by Charles Michel has been published about the so-called betrayal by Russia of the Armenian citizens. Not lack of reaction to the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh. I would like to remind Charles Michel and all of his supporters that it was the European Union who convened this summit in Brussels, where the Azerbaijani leadership was recognized? Or is it not the case? Before that, the Armenian leadership just made contrary statements, saying that about the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, and Charles Michel, he was just referring to the agreements without reference to the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh. Why did the EU not propose to care about the security of the residents of Nagorno-Karabakh? That was because the European Union, all those Charles Michel, Borrell, and Ursula von der Leyen, they were just engaged in provocation. And they did not care about the security of the residents. They just cared about our country, about anti-Russian, Russophobic approach in all their actions. And now they're just trying to denigrate the actions of our country to clear themselves of the responsibility, just denigrating Moscow. No, it's Brussels that is responsible for all the agreements that have been achieved. The 3 agreements between Moscow, Yerevan, and Baku have been literally changed by those summits on the territory of the EU countries. And the Yerevan stance was formed in a way under the influence of the EU, as they have informed just several months ago. And before that, the position was just the contrary. It's just the sovereign right of the Armenian authorities to form their position. But that should be coherent and expressed in an open way. We will see the results of this summit in Grenada. And yesterday, French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna
made a statement saying that Russia had failed to fulfill its obligations when settling the relations between Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan. But it's not France which should be talking about responsibilities, as France was the co-sponsor and the guarantor of fulfilling the Minsk obligations. But what we learned later on from Mr. Hollande is what they never planned to fulfill them. So if I was Catherine Colonna, I would keep silent about any kind of guarantees and obligations to help settle conflicts between countries in such situations where France thinks itself to be some kind of a mediator. I think it's a Security Council resolution, no less. But let's get back to the Catherine Colonna's statement. It's another lie, another attempt of the French authorities to play up the Karabakh situation. And now, as for what Russia did, for real, Russia helped the bloodshedding on the 9th of October. We have fulfilled a complex of statements from 2020 to 2023, a so-called roadmap for making up between Nagorno-Karabakh, which was later copied by the EU and the US, and then later on it was distorted to serve their own interests without caring for the people of the region. Russia made sure that the fighting stopped there, and that we help solving the humanitarian crisis where our people are dying there. We mourn their deaths. I would like to pose, what did France do? What did Brussels do? What did the EU do? I think it's no use of referring to the Washington here. But did we take any concrete steps? Did we do anything what they can claim now before the international community? Did we do anything but talk? It was just some kind of a PR action. So we convinced the Armenian authorities in Prague and Brussels to forget about the rights and security of the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, which led to the current crisis. Question is, when under the auspices of Brussels and with the help of Washington, I think, over there in Prague and Brussels, when the authorities took the new responsibilities upon them, they in no way, neither orally nor in writing, fixed the status, the security, and the guarantees for the people of Nagorno-Karabakh. So this was not a confirmation of the fact that the international West always led to chaos and suffering of ordinary people. Any more questions? No more questions. Let's continue. Is Stas here? Yes, Maria Vladimirovna, I'm here. Good afternoon. We have one question today. The media has leaked the fact that Russia and the US has held a secret negotiation station in Nagorno-Karabakh several days before the escalation of the situation. And Igor Kharvaev was present there, according to the media. Could you comment on this? Did this negotiations, were these negotiations held there? I'm not sure how secret it is, because the Washington and the EU have referred to us, and it's upon their initiative that we held a meeting, we established some kind of contact. The objective was made clear during the meeting, because we exchanged our opinions on the situation, and that was it. And if now this narrative will be played on by the Western media, if it will be presented as some kind of a provocative story, then maybe that was the goal of the US and the EU. Maybe we tried to create a new kind of provocation. So I don't think that there is any secret about this. It was just a regular exchange of opinions, but I think that we'll keep an eye on the way the West is going to present it now, and when the goals will be clear, their goals will be clear. Thank you. Is Sputnik here? If Sputnik is not here, we will proceed. Is Komsomolskaya Pravda here? Yes, yes, I'm sorry, Sputnik here. Okay, let's go on. Andrei Matyuhin, Radio Sputnik, Ms. Zakharova. To continue with the subject of Armenia, now we're talking about switching of Russian TV channels. As a deputy from a ruling civil contract fraction said on Saturday, Lucy Nebadalyan said that. But as we remember, such unfriendly steps have repeatedly led to anti-Russian sentiments in other countries. These were real repressions against our journalists and our media. We can remember Latvia, Estonia, France, Great Britain, and other countries. The question is how to maintain ties with the Armenian people, because politicians are one thing, and ordinary people and establishing contacts with them is another thing. I don't think that we have any problems with our fraternal nation of Armenian people. We will help them. We will continue to help them. And as I've already said, helping them with the help of our peacekeepers who shed their blood, helping Armenian peoples there in the fields, not in the cabinets. In the humanitarian field, financially, we will continue to help them. We have never lost any friends there, but we see that there are many provocations there. In 2000s, diplomats are working there, because 2,000 people comprise the American embassy there. But we know what we're up to. It's fake news, it's disinformation. It's surprising that the Armenian authorities do not see this. This kind of personnel would have been justified if they provided humanitarian help, if I don't know, if they shared food, clothes with those in need. But no, that's not the way it works. all those diplomats we are working on spreading fake news and information in the media, and against the backdrop of this, against the backdrop of 2,000 diplomats being present there, which does not confuse anyone in Yerevan. It does not make them think that they should take control of those control of information. So against this backdrop, some kind of deputy comes up with the initiative of blocking Russian TV channels, Russian media, on top of the fact that Russian journalists are denied the right of entry into Armenia. They are on stop lists now. And I would just like to remind you that, as we all know, the ruling authorities of Armenia had come up to force speaking in favor of the freedom of speech as one of the fundamental principles of democracy. But I don't think that it's some kind of a unilateral thing, because everyone should have the right to speak freely. These are alternative sources of information, and the decisions of for these people who consider this to be an important source of information, and this is up for people to decide if this media works on a legal basis. So stopping this kind of source of information is a strike against democracy. It's harassing democracy. There is no other name for that. This means attacking those fundamental principles upon which the current authority in Armenia is